In the basement of Boston's Carney Hospital, a woman screamed for 13 years, and no one came to help her. Her name was carved into the stone walls with her fingernails, and by the time they found her body in 1917, she had been forgotten by everyone except the rats that shared her tomb. This is the true story of Mary Mallon's predecessor, a woman whose name was erased from medical records, but whose suffering would expose one of the most horrifying chapters in American public health history. What began as a routine quarantine in 1904 became a living death sentence that lasted over 5,000 days, all in the name of protecting society from a disease that may never have existed. The year was 1904, and Boston stood as America's beacon of medical progress. The city's hospitals pioneered new surgical techniques. Its medical schools trained the nation's finest physicians, and its public health department boasted some of the most advanced disease prevention protocols in the world. But beneath this veneer of scientific advancement lurked something far more sinister, a willingness to sacrifice individual lives for the perceived greater good. Dr. Cornelius Ashford ran the infectious disease ward at Carney Hospital with military precision. A veteran of the Spanish-American War, he had witnessed firsthand the devastation that epidemic diseases could wreak upon populations. When he returned to civilian practice, he brought with him an obsessive fear of contagion and an unwavering belief that extreme measures were not only justified but necessary to protect public health. Into this environment, Martha Hennigan arrived on a cold February morning in 1904. The 32-year-old Irish immigrant had been brought to the hospital by city health officials after her boarding house had reported that she had been suffering from persistent fever, night sweats, and a peculiar rash that covered her arms and torso. Her symptoms, Dr. Ashford determined, were consistent with a rare and highly contagious tropical disease he had encountered during his military service. What happened next would challenge everything we think we know about medical ethics and human dignity. Dr. Ashford ordered Martha's immediate isolation in the hospital's basement quarantine ward, a series of concrete cells originally designed to house the violently insane. These rooms, with their thick stone walls and barred windows, had been repurposed during the tuberculosis epidemic of the 1890s to contain the most infectious patients. Martha was placed in cell 7, a windowless chamber measuring just 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single cot, a bucket for waste, and a slot in the heavy wooden door through which food could be passed. The initial quarantine period was set at 30 days, standard protocol for unknown tropical diseases. But as Martha's symptoms persisted and Dr. Ashford became increasingly convinced that she carried a pathogen unlike anything in medical literature, 30 days became 60, then 90, then indefinitely. Hospital records from the Massachusetts State Archives reveal that Dr. Ashford had become obsessed with Martha's case, viewing her as a living laboratory specimen that could unlock the secrets of tropical disease transmission. Martha's isolation was absolute. No visitors were permitted, no other patients were allowed contact, and even hospital staff interaction was minimized to brief food deliveries and medical observations conducted through the door slot. Dr. Ashford believed that any unnecessary human contact risked spreading what he termed Hennigan's disease, a condition he was convinced could trigger a city-wide epidemic. The first year of Martha's confinement passed in bureaucratic obscurity. Her boarding house had reported her missing to authorities, but when they inquired at the hospital, they were told she had been transferred to a state facility for treatment of a contagious condition. Her family in Ireland received no word of her fate, and gradually Martha Hennigan simply disappeared from the world of the living, while her heart continued to beat in the darkness below Boston streets. Dr. Ashford's treatment of Martha became increasingly experimental. Convinced that her persistent symptoms indicated an entirely new class of infectious agent, he subjected her to a series of procedures that would be considered torture by today's standards. Ice baths to reduce fever, caustic chemical treatments for her rash, and periodic blood draws that left her weak and pale. Most disturbingly, he began treating her with various experimental compounds, including mercury preparations and arsenic-based medications that had no proven efficacy against any known disease. The basement quarantine ward became Dr. Ashford's private research laboratory, and Martha became his unwilling test subject. His detailed medical notes, discovered in 1987 during renovation of the hospital, reveal a man who had convinced himself that Martha's suffering served a greater scientific purpose. Subject continues to manifest novel symptomology, he wrote in October 1905, extended observation period necessary to fully catalog disease progression and evaluate treatment protocols. Patient compliance remains poor, but sedation maintains necessary research conditions. By 1906, Martha's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. Prolonged isolation, experimental treatments, and the psychological trauma of indefinite confinement had transformed her from a vibrant young woman into what hospital orderlies described as a living ghost. She had lost significant weight, her hair had begun to falling out, and she had developed what Dr. Ashford termed profound melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe clinical depression. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Martha's ordeal were her desperate attempts to maintain human connection despite her isolation. She began talking to herself in both English and Gaelic, conducting conversations with imaginary visitors from her childhood in County Cork. Orderlies reported hearing her singing traditional Irish songs late into the night, her voice echoing through the concrete corridors like the wail of a banshee. She also began keeping a diary of sorts, scratching words into the stone walls of her cell with fragments of her metal food tray. These wall carvings, photographed by hospital investigators in 1917, provide our most direct insight into Martha's mental state during her prolonged captivity. Day 847. Mama would be making soda bread now. Can smell it through the stone. Another, dated several years later, simply states, I am Martha Hennigan. I am alive. God help me. I am alive. As Martha's quarantine entered her fourth year, questions about her continued confinement began to surface within the hospital administration. Several nurses had expressed concern about the ethics of indefinite isolation,
and a few junior physicians had questioned whether Dr. Ashford's diagnosis was accurate. But Dr. Ashford's reputation as a leading infectious disease specialist, combined with the genuine fear of epidemic disease that permeated early 20th century medicine, allowed him to maintain absolute authority over Martha's case.
The turning point came in 1908 when Dr. Sarah Whitman joined Carney Hospital's staff as an assistant physician. Dr. Whitman, one of the few female doctors practicing in Boston at the time, had studied at Johns Hopkins and had extensive experience with tropical diseases acquired during missionary work in the Philippines. When she learned of Martha's case and requested to examine the patient, Dr. Ashford initially refused, citing contamination risks. But Dr. Whitman persisted and eventually gained access to Martha's cell for a brief examination. What she found horrified her. Martha, by then barely recognizable as human, had developed symptoms that Dr. Whitman immediately recognized as the result of prolonged mercury and arsenic poisoning, not tropical disease. The persistent rash that Dr. Ashford had attributed to exotic pathogens was actually caused by his own experimental treatments. The fever and night sweats were side effects of the medications he had been administering. Dr. Whitman's medical report, filed with the hospital's chief administrator in November 1908, concluded that Martha suffered from no infectious disease whatsoever. Her original symptoms in 1904 had likely been caused by a common bacterial infection that would have resolved with basic antibiotic treatment, if such treatments had been available at the time. Instead, Dr. Ashford's treatments had created a chronic toxic condition that mimicked the very disease he claimed to be studying. But even armed with this evidence, the hospital administration faced a terrible dilemma. Martha had been quarantined for nearly 5 years under the authority of the city's public health department. Releasing her would require admitting that a horrific mistake had been made, potentially exposing the hospital to legal liability and public scandal. Moreover, Martha's psychological condition had deteriorated to the point where her ability to function in society was questionable. The decision was made to continue Martha's confinement while quietly phasing out Dr. Ashford's experimental treatments. Martha would remain in isolation, ostensibly for her own protection rather than society's. Dr. Ashford was transferred to another department, and Martha's case file was buried in hospital archives with a notation that she was a chronic care patient requiring indefinite supervision. For Martha, this change in official status meant little. She remained in the same concrete cell, eating the same meager meals, listening to the same sounds of footsteps overhead. If anything, her condition worsened as the years passed. The brief medical attention she had received from Dr. Ashford's experiments, however misguided, was replaced by near total neglect. Food was delivered, waste was removed, but Martha's human needs for conversation, sunlight, touch, and dignity were ignored entirely. By 1912, Martha had been in quarantine for 8 years. Hospital records from this period describe her as docile and withdrawn, medical euphemisms for a woman whose spirit had been systematically crushed by prolonged isolation. She had stopped singing, stopped talking to imaginary companions, and had even ceased her wall carvings. The vibrant young immigrant who had entered Carney Hospital in 1904 had been replaced by what staff privately referred to as the basement ghost. The few hospital employees who remembered Martha's case assumed she would die quietly in her cell, a forgotten victim of medical overreach. But Martha proved more resilient than anyone imagined. Month after month, year after year, she continued to breathe, to eat, to exist in her stone tomb. Her survival became almost supernatural to the staff who occasionally glimpsed her during food deliveries, a pale, silent figure who seemed to have transcended normal human limitations through sheer endurance. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, please let me know in the comments below what you think about how far medical authority should extend in the name of public health. And if you want to hear more stories like this one that expose the dark side of medical history, Please subscribe to the channel. These forgotten victims deserve to have their stories told. The end came suddenly in March 1917, 13 years and 21 days after Martha first entered quarantine. An orderly delivering her morning meal found her collapsed on her cot, finally released from a captivity that had lasted 5,001 days. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, but those familiar with her case understood that Martha had died of something far more complex: the accumulated weight of years of isolation, neglect, and medical abuse. Martha's death presented the hospital administration with a final cruel irony. Because she had been quarantined as an infectious disease patient, her body required special handling and could not be released to family members who might still be alive in Ireland. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Boston's Potter's Field, her name recorded only in hospital ledgers that would be sealed for decades to prevent potential lawsuits. Dr. Cornelius Ashford continued practicing medicine until his retirement in 1924, never facing any consequences for his treatment of Martha. In his published memoirs, he made no mention of her case, focusing instead on his contributions to tropical disease research and his service in the Spanish-American War. He died in 1931, taking whatever conscience he may have had about Martha's fate to his grave. The case of Martha Hennigan was not unique in early 20th century American medicine. Across the country, individuals deemed threats to public health were subjected to indefinite quarantine under conditions that would have been illegal if applied to convicted criminals. The infamous case of typhoid Mary Mallon was quarantined for decades in New York, represents only the most well-known example of medical authorities wielding unchecked power over vulnerable populations. What makes Martha's case particularly tragic is how easily it could have been prevented. A simple second opinion in 1904 would have revealed Dr. Ashford's misdiagnosis. Basic oversight of his experimental treatments would have exposed their harmful effects. Most fundamentally, respect for Martha's basic human rights would have limited the duration and severity of her confinement. Instead, a combination of medical arrogance, bureaucratic cowardice, and societal indifference allowed one woman's suffering to continue for over 13 years. Martha's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the balance between individual rights and collective security, questions that remain relevant in our current era of pandemic response and public health policy. Today, medical ethics committees, patient advocates, and strict legal protections exist to prevent cases like Martha's from recurring. But her ghost continues to haunt the corridors of American medicine, reminding us that the greatest medical advances mean nothing if they come at the cost of our fundamental humanity. In the basement of what was once Carney Hospital, now converted to luxury condominiums, tourists and residents walk unknowingly over the space where Martha spent the final 13 years of her life. Her name appears on no memorial plaques. Her story merits no historical markers. She remains what she became during her lifetime, a forgotten victim of medicine's capacity both for healing and horror.
The next time you hear officials invoke public health to justify extreme measures, remember Martha Hennigan. Remember that behind every policy, every quarantine order, every medical decision, there are individual human beings whose lives hang in the balance. The most dangerous epidemic of all may be the one that causes us to forget that every patient, no matter how feared, how isolated, how inconvenient, deserves to be treated with the dignity that Martha was denied for 5,001 days. Some questions don't have easy answers. Was Dr. Ashford a monster, or simply a man whose fear overwhelmed his compassion? Could Martha have been saved if she had been born in a different era, or treated at a different hospital? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other Martha Hennigans suffered in silence, their stories never recorded, their names never remembered? In the end, Martha Hennigan's greatest tragedy was not her death, but her disappearance from life while still living. Her story serves as a haunting reminder that in medicine, as in all human endeavors, our greatest technical achievements mean nothing if we lose sight of our most basic moral obligations to one another.